I found out my husband became a father again. When I opened a birth certificate he thought he'd hidden. It wasn't a stranger's name on the father line. It was his. And the mother, a woman half my age, someone I once helped through a divorce. After 18 years of marriage, he gave another woman the child he said he never wanted with me. I'm Corinne, 61, and that day I didn't cry. I planned. Tell me, what would you do if your husband built a secret family while sharing a bed with you? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear what justice looks like to you. For most of our marriage, I believed we were steady, not perfect, not passionate like the movies, but safe. Safe enough to breathe in the same room without performing. Safe enough to share silence without discomfort. Russell was my second husband. We met when I was 43, a therapist recently widowed with 2 grown children. He was a professor of sociology, soft-spoken, silver-haired, and brilliant. He lectured on family systems and wrote essays on ethical commitment in long-term relationships. That irony would come full circle, eventually. We built a life in Port Townsend, Washington, a quiet coastal town with foggy mornings and coffee shops where everyone knew your order. He loved that. Said it felt like living inside a novel. We shared a garden, a joint bank account, and a habit of finishing each other's books. In the evenings, we'd sit under the soft whir of the ceiling fan. Me with my tea, him with his annotated journals discussing parenting philosophies we no longer needed. When it rained, he'd make mushroom risotto and hum Sinatra under his breath. Our kitchen always smelled like garlic and rosemary. I never pressured him to be a father to my kids, and he never pushed me to be someone I wasn't. That was our unspoken agreement: mutual respect, independence, no hidden corners. So when he told me years ago that he didn't want children of his own, that he had missed that chapter, I accepted it. Gratefully even, because I thought it meant he chose me for me, not for the legacy I couldn't give. My children, Miles and Delia, both adults, now adored him. They called him Russell Never Dad, but they trusted him. We'd have Sunday dinners by the water where he'd tell stories about the absurdities of academia, and I'd smile at how natural it all felt. He used to say we were past the phase of proving things, and I believed him. He used to kiss my hand when we passed each other in the kitchen, used to lay a folded newspaper beside my mug in the morning. 18 years, 18 Thanksgiving turkeys. 18 times I stood beside him at faculty galas, introducing myself as his better half even when I wasn't sure I deserved the title. We had inside jokes, shared passwords, a compost bin neither of us remembered to take out. We didn't fight much, just the occasional silence when he forgot a date, or I asked too many questions. Nothing dramatic, nothing I ever thought would grow teeth. Looking back now, maybe we weren't as steady as I thought. Maybe I mistook routine for loyalty, comfort for clarity. But you don't think like that when someone still kisses your forehead before leaving for campus. You just believe them. You believe the quiet. You believe in the absence of drama. You believe the man who teaches about marriage would never lie in his own. At least I did. It started with small things. A name I hadn't heard before mentioned casually mid-conversation over morning toast. Jenna's been struggling, Russell said, reaching for the blackberry jam, like we weren't about to be late for our walk. She's trying to balance work and her health. I might stop by her place this week. I blinked. Jenna. He didn't look up. Rathmore. She used to be my student. Now she's doing nonprofit work downtown. We ran into each other at the library. I nodded, but something tugged at the edge of my memory. That name. It wasn't new. Jenna Rathmore had once been my client briefly. She came in years ago for post-divorce therapy. Quiet, wounded, early 40s, no kids. I didn't mention it then, didn't want to make it a thing. But that week, Russell was out late 3 times. Visiting Jenna, he said. Always with a reason: her plumbing had failed, her car wouldn't start. She needed help with a grant proposal. I believed him, mostly, until one night I passed by his office and saw his phone lit up on the desk. He was in the shower. I didn't touch it, just glanced. The screen read, "Thanks again. Jonah keeps asking when you'll come by." Jonah. I stood there for a full minute, heart-steady breath, caught in the space between disbelief and dread. When he stepped out, I was back in the kitchen, hands calmly folding dish towels. He didn't know I saw it. I didn't ask. But from that night on, I began watching. He started carrying his phone in his jacket instead of leaving it on the counter. His tone with me became lighter, like a man who was always halfway out the door. He started shaving more often, wearing cologne again, the one he used to spritz only for gala nights, musk and bergamot. It clung to his scarf one evening after he claimed he'd been at the bookstore. He stopped finishing his tea, stopped reading beside me. And when I asked what time he'd be home, he'd say, "Don't wait up, it might run late." Late for what? For Jenna, for Jonah. I still hadn't asked, not directly, but silence can be sharper than accusation. And inside mine a question was growing like frost on the inside of a window. How long had I been living with only half the truth? It was a Wednesday morning when the message came. I was watering the herbs on our windowsill, parsley, thyme, and a wilting basil that refused to survive. Indoors when my phone buzzed with a name I hadn't seen in years. Monica Ellery. She and I used to volunteer together at the hospice center. We'd lost touch when her husband passed. The text read, "Batten. Corinne. I hope this isn't out of line, but I saw Russell at Cascade General last week. Maternity wing, holding a newborn. Thought you should know." I reread it, twice. My hands were still damp from the watering can. I dried them on my apron too quickly, heart starting to race. I called her. "Monica, what exactly did you see?" She sounded nervous, apologetic. He was outside room 326. The nurse wheeled out a baby. He was holding the child like a father would, smiling, talking to the woman beside him. I didn't recognize her. Younger, mid-40s maybe. A chill ran through my chest like cracked ice. "Are you sure?" I asked, trying to keep my voice even. I wasn't close enough to hear names, but Corinne, he kissed the baby's forehead. He looked proud. I thanked her, hung up, stared at the basil plant until my vision blurred. Cascade General. That was the hospital where Jenna's divorce papers had listed her OB/GYN. I knew because I'd reviewed them myself during our brief therapy sessions. I sat down at the kitchen table, opened my laptop, pulled up the hospital's public birth announcements. They didn't list full names, just initials and dates. But on a page dated 2 weeks prior, I saw it. And baby boy, JR, born to JR, and RL. Jenna Rathmore, Russell Langford. My stomach turned. There it was, proof hiding in plain sight. Suddenly, the scent of rosemary from last night's roast made me nauseous. I closed the laptop, breathing slowly, measured. It no longer mattered whether he loved me or meant no harm. What mattered was this: he had lied. To me, to our children, to the quiet life we had so carefully constructed. He had become a father again after years of telling me that door was closed, and he hadn't even offered me the dignity of truth. That's when I knew I wasn't just betrayed, I was erased. I waited until Saturday morning. He was at the kitchen island slicing apples for his oatmeal, the way he always did, thin, precise, methodical. A habit he claimed brought him calm. I sat down across from him, slid a manila folder onto the counter between the apples and his mug. He didn't look up right away. "What's this?" "Something I think you should see before I lose the ability to speak civilly." He opened the folder. Inside the screenshot from the hospital announcement, a printed message from Monica's text, and a photo I had taken from Jenna's old social media, a blurry image of her holding a baby in a hospital room, the corner of Russell's jacket, unmistakable in the frame. He stared for a long time, too long. Then calmly he folded the papers back into the folder and said, "Did you go through my things?" That was his first response. Not denial, not remorse, not even shock. Just accusation? I laughed, not kindly. "You fathered a child with another woman. You funneled money from our retirement account. And your first concern is my boundaries." He sighed, set the folder down like it bored him. "Corinne, this doesn't have to turn into some theatrical scene. Is Jonah your son?" He didn't flinch. "Yes, just that. One word. No elaboration, no apology, like confirming the weather." My mouth went dry. "You told me you never wanted children." "I didn't. Back then, things change." "Things change. That's what you tell your wife of 18 years after building a whole life behind her back." His voice sharpened just a touch. "Don't make this more emotional than it needs to be." Jenna was struggling. She didn't have support. I was in a position to help. I didn't plan to become a father. He finally looked me in the eye. Maybe I missed the chance the first time. Maybe I wanted to leave something behind. I froze. Leave something behind as in, not me. He hesitated, and in that pause everything collapsed. Because we both knew the answer. He stood, picked up his bowl, dropped a spoon into the sink, then said without turning around, "I'm sorry you found out this way. Not sorry he did it, just sorry I found out." And in that moment I knew he wasn't hiding anymore, because he didn't care if I saw him. That night I didn't sleep. I lay in bed with my back to him, listening to the slow, even sound of his breath, as if nothing had changed. As if the truth he'd confessed just hours earlier was something we could fold into our routine like laundry. I stared at the ceiling fan, counting its turns like they were seconds ticking toward something. Not rage, not yet. What I felt was cold, not the kind you fix with blankets. but the kind that settles deep in your spine when you realize you've been living beside a stranger who only pretended to love the same version of the future. I thought about the first night we met, the way he spoke about integrity, about building trust brick by brick. He said real love meant showing up with your full self. But I had shown up every damn day. He had only shown me the version of him he thought I could accept. I thought about Jenna, the woman I once gave advice to, told her she deserved more than crumbs. Did she think she'd taken something that was hers to have? Or did she even know I existed in this version of Russell's life? I could have screamed, thrown something, packed a bag. But instead I made tea. Chamomile, the kind that settles your stomach when it knots from too much truth. I sat by the window with the mug in my hand and watched the fog roll in over the bay. The kind of fog that hides things, that makes everything look softer than it really is. And I realized for 18 years I had been living in a kind of fog too. A curated version of marriage, quiet and composed, built on half-truths and polite nods. But not anymore. I didn't want apologies. I didn't want explanations. I wanted the one thing he never gave me, a choice. So I made one. I would not stay. I would not keep his secret. And I would not let him keep the version of me that stayed small, grateful, silent. No, he wanted to leave something behind. So would I. The next morning, I watched him butter his toast with the same quiet focus he once used to write lectures on trust. He didn't notice I was staring, didn't ask how I slept, didn't ask anything at all. And that silence, it told me more than any confession ever could. It told me he'd moved on long before I found the truth, that he had built an exit in his mind and was simply waiting for me to find the door. But I wasn't leaving, not yet, not without a reckoning, because I remembered who I was before him, before quiet compromises, before shared calendars and joint taxes. I was a mother who raised 2 children on her own after burying a husband too young. I was a therapist who held the weight of other people's betrayals without ever letting mine show. And I was a woman who believed in legacy, not the kind built through bloodlines, but the kind earned through honesty. Russell had made his choice. He wanted to leave something behind. So would I, but mine wouldn't come in the shape of a child. It would come in the shape of truth. And everyone, his colleagues, his students, his polished little world, would see the man behind the lectures. That was the moment. The line that can't be uncrossed. The quiet, unshakable knowing I was done protecting him. Revenge didn't come to me all at once. It came in folders, in labeled USB drives, in quiet screenshots taken at 2 a.m., and in receipts I'd once thrown away without a second glance. Russell had grown careless, comfortable. The first thing I checked was our joint savings account. The numbers didn't lie. Thousands had been transferred in irregular patterns to a J. Rathmore Consulting to an account marked medical reimbursements, all without a single conversation. Then came the emails. He had used his university email to forward legal documents, birth-related instructions, even photos. Photos, one in particular, stopped me cold. A picture of Russell in a hospital chair, holding Jonah sleeping against his chest. Russell wasn't smiling at the baby. He was smiling at Jenna, who stood behind the camera, blurred but unmistakable. I saved everything. The emails, the transfers, the photo, the printed text from Monica, the hospital announcement. I even printed out an old newsletter from his department, a piece titled Fatherhood Fidelity and the Future of Family. He had written it, quoted himself. That would come in handy. Then came the question, where? Where would the truth hurt most? And the answer arrived in our mailbox 2 days later. Russell had been invited to give a keynote at the Northwest Ethics Symposium topic, the moral architecture of modern marriage. It was too perfect to be coincidence. He was scheduled to speak to a packed auditorium, professors, former students, donors, people who admired him, respected him, people who believed his every word. So I made arrangements, registered for the event under my full name, requested a front row seat, booked a private consult with the AV team. All I needed was 10 minutes, one voice and one screen. Russell had spent 18 years writing a legacy. Now it was my turn to edit the final chapter. The day of the symposium arrived gray and windless. I wore navy, simple, professional, the kind of outfit you'd expect from a retired therapist, not from a woman about to detonate her marriage in public. The auditorium at Whitmore Hall was nearly full when I arrived. I scanned the crowd, professors with their lanyards, students scribbling notes, donors sipping coffee from compostable cups. Russell stood at the podium exactly as I remembered him, in his prime, chin. Lifted voice calm, posture noble. His slide read, The Moral Architecture of Modern Marriage. Poetic. He started with statistics, a few academic quotes, a quip that drew polite laughter. Then came the line I had memorized from his own essay years ago. The legacy of love is built on truth shared, never concealed. That was my cue. I rose from my seat. Before we continue, I said loud enough for the microphone to catch me. Perhaps we should revisit what Professor Langford has chosen to conceal. The room went still, heads turned. Russell's face drained of color, but his posture remained frozen. I stepped onto the stage. This I held up a folder is the story behind the lecture. I turned to the projectionist who had received my USB an hour earlier. A photo lit up the screen. Russell in the maternity ward cradling Jonah. Gasps, rustling of paper. A woman near the back covered her mouth. Next slide, a screenshot of the birth announcement. Another bank transfers. Then finally a paragraph from his own writing framed beneath the word hypocrisy. I didn't raise my voice, didn't cry. I simply looked at the audience and said, for 18 years, I shared a home with this man. He told me he didn't want children. That legacy didn't require blood. While I cooked his meals, paid his bills, held his secrets, he built a family with someone else. The room was silent. Russell didn't speak. Couldn't. He simply stood there, hands on either side of the podium, as the legacy he had written for himself crumbled in front of the very people who once applauded him. And I stepped down, walked past the rows of stunned faces, and didn't look back. I didn't stay to see the end of his speech. There was nothing left for him to say. By the time I reached the parking lot, my hands were steady, my breath even. I thought I might cry. I didn't. I just drove home, windows down, letting the November air clear everything that had clung to me for far too long. By sunset, the university had already called. A woman from the ethics committee, her voice tight formal, confirmed they'd be conducting a review. Russell's department chair sent a group email the next morning announcing that Professor Langford will be taking an indefinite leave of absence. Students posted clips of the moment online. I didn't watch them, but Delia did. My daughter called that night, her voice low with awe. Mom, she said you just stood there. You looked like you'd already moved on. I had. Russell didn't come home that night, or the next. When he finally returned 3 days later, he said nothing. He moved around the house like a tenant, packing books, unplugging chargers, folding sweaters into boxes he hadn't even asked permission to use. He didn't apologize, not really. Just one sentence as he passed me in the hallway. I suppose this is what you'd call justice. I didn't answer. Not because I didn't have words, but because he no longer deserved them. A week later, I received a letter from the university. A quiet acknowledgement Russell had been asked to relinquish his position on the Institutional Ethics Board. The final blow. A statement in the alumni bulletin citing a need for realigned leadership values. As for Jenna, she never contacted me, but I heard from a friend that she had checked into postpartum therapy 2 towns over. Russell was seen there once briefly, then not again. The whispers didn't last long, because the truth is, people like Russell aren't remembered for their collapses. They're remembered for how carefully they built the pedestal and how suddenly it cracked. I didn't need applause or sympathy. I only needed what I had been denied for far too long, a voice. And now that I had used it, I wasn't about to go quiet again. The morning he left for good, he didn't slam the door, didn't beg, didn't even pause on the threshold. He simply carried 2 boxes down the porch steps, set them in the back seat of his car, and drove away like it was a Tuesday errand. I watched from the kitchen window, not because I cared where he was going, but because I wanted to witness the moment the house exhaled. And it did softly, quietly, like something had been holding its breath for years. I changed the locks that afternoon, not because I was afraid he'd come back, but because I wanted to feel the sound of new keys in my hand, a weight that was entirely mine. That night, I stood barefoot in the hallway, noticing how the silence felt different. Not empty, just honest. The divorce was swift, clean, clinical. Washington State doesn't require long explanations when the split is mutual, and Russell, to my surprise, didn't fight. Didn't argue over the house, the car, or the funds still in our joint retirement account. Maybe he was too ashamed, or maybe he was just relieved to no longer keep pretending. The only line he challenged mildly was when my lawyer requested compensation for misused marital assets. He supported another household, I told the judge, without my knowledge or consent. It was enough. A ruling in my favor. Half of what was spent on Jenna and Jonah was returned through liquidated investments Russell had to surrender. I didn't touch the money. I donated it quietly to a legal aid clinic for single mothers, not because I forgave her, but because someone needed to turn that money into something that actually meant justice. Because revenge, when done right, doesn't need applause. It just needs to leave a scar where silence used to be. In the weeks that followed, I began removing Russell's imprint from the house, not in rage and ritual. I cleared his side of the closet first. The suits smelled like cedar and old lectures. I folded them carefully, bagged them, donated them to a nonprofit that helped young men prepare for interviews. I deleted his Netflix profile, his name from the mailbox. His books, well, most of them I donated to the library except one. The one he signed to me on our 10th anniversary. To Corinne, the stillness in my storm. I kept it, not for him, but for me, to remember that even a lie can feel like shelter until it collapses. I boxed up the last of his framed photos from faculty events, took down the watercolor of the cabin he used to dream about retiring in. It went into storage. Because I had no interest in curating a space that mourned what never really existed. Miles and Delia visited more often after the divorce. We cooked together again, watched old films, laughed over silly things. Delia brought me a tea towel that read, "Strong women don't have to yell." I hung it by the stove. One evening she asked, "Do you think he ever really loved you?" I thought about it. I think I said he loved the version of me that needed less. And now I needed nothing from him. Jenna never reached out, not even when the final court notice went public. But I heard from Monica again, just a brief email. "She's back in therapy," it read. "Alone mostly. He doesn't visit often." I didn't reply. Some threads don't need tying. The symposium posted a formal retraction of Russell's talk. His department removed his essays from the syllabus. And when I walked by campus months later, I saw his name peeled off the glass office door, replaced with someone younger, someone still idealistic. I didn't feel triumph, just peace. Because justice isn't about destroying someone. It's about restoring the space they once occupied, so it can finally breathe again. Spring arrived early that year. The garden bloomed brighter than it had in seasons. I planted new herbs, tore out the rosemary bush, too many memories clinging to its roots. Started fresh with lemon balm and lavender. I rearranged the living room, painted the reading nook a pale green, brought back a rocking chair I'd once stored in the garage. Not to sit and grieve, to look forward. I even took a part-time job again, not for money, but for joy. A local center needed a mentor for women 50 plus, widows, divorcees, women with more behind them than ahead, but still with fire in their bones. I told them what I now knew, that survival isn't the end of the story. Sometimes survival is just the preface to becoming. And as I stood by the window watching a storm roll in across the bay, I whispered to myself, not bitter, not broken. I was never his legacy. I was always my own. A year passed. 12 full moons, 3 new hairstyles, and exactly 47 cups of chamomile tea, brewed at 3 a.m. when sleep wouldn't come. I could count them because I let each one matter. That's something grief teaches you. Even in betrayal, every moment still counts. Even when the person leaves, the life doesn't disappear with them. It simply reshapes. My days took on a new rhythm, not busy, but steady. Mornings were for walking by the bay. Afternoons I'd spend volunteering at the community center, mentoring women who, like me, had once thought they were past their reinvention date. We talked about things people often overlook. What silence sounds like when it's safe. What strength feels like when it doesn't need to shout. How legacy isn't what you leave behind for others, but what you claim back for yourself. One woman, Lorraine, came to me shaking. "Do you ever feel foolish?" she asked, "for not seeing it sooner." I smiled. Yes. But then I remember I wasn't foolish. I was faithful. That's not something to apologize for. Faithfulness, I've learned, is a mirror that doesn't crack just because someone else stops looking into it. I planted tomatoes that summer, the kind Russell used to say were too acidic. I picked them early, left them on the windowsill, and smiled every time I added one to a salad. Not in spite, in peace. Because healing is not about deleting someone. It's about detaching their voice from the choices you make for yourself. Miles came to visit in July with his partner Luis. They brought wine and stories from the city. Delia came later that month with her 2 cats and a folder full of legal cases she wanted my opinion on. We made sangria together, played jazz too loud, argued over whether or not tomato belongs in gumbo. We laughed, the kind of laughter that used to feel like a luxury. Now it felt like a right. I cleaned out the attic in early autumn, found a box labeled Retirement Plans, Russell. I opened it once. Inside, brochures for cabins, a rough outline for a book, and one photo of him and Jenna holding Jonah tucked between a university program and an old passport. I didn't cry. I closed the box, sealed it, and donated it to the recycling center. Some paper memories don't deserve fire, only forgetting. I don't keep photos of Russell anymore, but I do keep the photo of me at the symposium the moment I stood on that stage. Someone captured it and sent it anonymously. It's not glamorous, but I'm upright, head high, eyes calm. I framed it, not because it reminds me of pain, but because it reminds me that I didn't vanish. I faced it, I spoke. and I walked away without needing to burn the building behind me. Some days I think about Jenna, not with rage but with clarity. She got the child, the man, the story, but I got the truth. And more than that, I got the space to grow again. In late November, the community center held a writing workshop. The prompt was, "What would you tell your younger self?" I wrote one sentence, "You are not forgettable just because someone forgets how to love you." And I meant it. Now when I lie in bed, no longer on the edge, no longer bracing for absences, I stretch out, take up the space that's mine. I read until I fall asleep. I set 2 teacups in the cupboard but only use one. And I'm content with that, because I'm not waiting for someone to return. I'm not hoping for someone new to arrive. I'm just here present, full, enough. If you're listening to this and you've ever been forgotten, abandoned, replaced, I want you to hear this. You don't need to start over to reclaim yourself. You just need to step back into your own name. Let your voice be louder than your silence. Let your peace be deeper than your revenge. And if someone tries to rewrite your worth, pick up the pen, write the final chapter yourself.